All right. So today we're going to talk about the Iron Triangle. And what the Iron Triangle is it's basically just a relationship between three parts of government. Well, interest groups aren't really government, but three parts of policymaking and how they either support each other or can get in each other's way in order to make policy and or prevent policy from being made. And the three legs of the Iron Triangle are going to be interest groups, government agencies, in other words, bureaucracy, and congressional committees. And it's worth noting that for any policy issue, any kind of topic, there is likely an interest group, a government agency, and a congressional committee that all kind of deal with this. So, for example, let's take the environment. The interest group would be involved would be, say, Greenpeace or the World Wildlife Federation. The government agency would actually be the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and the congressional committee would be the Congressional Committee on Science and the Environment. And so these guys and girls make laws about the environment. That's going to be things like actual laws that affect how businesses do business. Things like cap and trade or just pollution laws, but they're actual laws. And they actually don't do, when it comes to the environment, these guys don't do much of that. Who does all the work when it comes to that is these guys, or not. Take another example where we have the group called, or the government agency called the FCC, or Federal Communications Commission. They're responsible for, among other things, television, radio, communications, but they also manage the internet. They make policies about the internet. Recently, the idea of something called net neutrality, or that the idea of net neutrality is that any service provider and any consumer has access to the same kind of speeds and basically access to websites. Removing net neutrality would allow companies to actually sell faster lanes, more bandwidth to companies. So like to require Netflix, for example, Comcast can require Netflix to pay more money if they want people to actually view their content. And if Netflix doesn't pay, but say Hulu does pay, then Hulu will be faster than Netflix. Net neutrality kind of ensures that everyone has access to all the various sites. For example, if you had an AT&T connection and then you log onto your computer using an AT&T connection and you go to a website that is Comcast supported but not AT&T supported, it might run slow for you. With net neutrality, that's not the case. Anyway, so the government agency, the FCC, who was at the time of net neutrality, and I think still is, run by a guy by the name of Ajit Pai, wanted to revisit net neutrality and actually remove net neutrality policies, because that is what the government agency does. What the government agencies do is they implement policy and regulations. So government agencies have regulatory power. You know what? I'll make a separate video about what government agencies can do, but they have regulatory powers. So they can't make laws, but they can make policies with fines associated. They can't make it illegal necessarily to pollute a stream, but they can make policies and issue regulations saying the businesses can't pollute streams, and if they do, they will get a hefty fine and or other bad things happen to them. Anyway, so the interest group associated with, say, net neutrality would be some consumer rights interest, any consumer right interest group, any interest group representing the internet or corporations like Comcast and AT&T or Netflix. Those are interest groups involved. Anyway, so the way they interact is this. Government agencies are able to support congressional committees because if congressional committees make a law then the government agency can implement that law. They're responsible for implementing the law. And so they can support them by implementing the law in a way in which the congressional committees have recommended. Congressional committees can't tell government agencies how to implement the law they made. They can only make recommendations. The government agency following those recommendations and consulting with the congressional committee ensures that kind of their vision is supported and seen. So that's a way that government agencies can support congressional committees. Alternately, if they choose not to support them, congressional committees can make a law, and government agencies can just do whatever they want, can implement it in a way that is kind of not consistent with the vision of the congressional committee. Now, the congressional committee can do things about that. So let's just take a law. Let's say we'll make it a pollution law. Congress wants to make a law making the use of a certain kind of chemical in production illegal. But they can't do anything other than make the law. So congressional committees, in a perfect world, if this works the way it's supposed to, congressional committees will consult with the government agency and say, listen, what can we do here? If we make a law, what is realistic for you to implement, and how would you implement it? And the government agency would then tell the congressional committee, this is how we can implement this law you're making, and this is what we can do about it. And the congressional committee can say, okay, that sounds good. And then they make the law and give the government agency the money because they're responsible for the budget, and they go and do it. These guys, so what would happen is maybe a environmental interest group might consult with the congressional committee, offer them research, things like that, and say, listen, if you make this law, we can support you. And if you make this law, we will make sure that the people on this committee will get a lot of funding in their next election because we want this law. Alternately, an interest group that doesn't want the law could say, listen, if you make this law, we're going to spend money on somebody else to beat you in the next election, and you'll be out of a job. So they have to take in consideration the influence that they have. But if it's the supportive interest group, then that interest group could support the congressional committee in making the pollution law. And then the government agency, once the law is in their hands to kind of implement, they can implement it the way they see fit. But they're going to take in consideration the congressional committee's recommendations and their funding, because if they don't do what they want, these guys can not only deny them funding in the future, but can also exhibit oversight, call hearings, call these guys into a congressional hearing and say, listen, why aren't you doing what we told you to do, or why are you doing something different than what we intended? These two interact because when these guys are trying to implement the law, these guys can make it even either easier or harder for those laws, or for those, to implement laws and make policy. Because these guys, what they can do is say, we can help you. We can help get the word out. We have more advertising budget and things like that. We can help you make this policy known and help you facilitate it. Or if it's an interest group that is in disagreement, they could say, we're gonna do everything we can to make this law look bad. We're gonna make commercials and put things on the internet that make people hate this law and hate this policy and hate you. So that's kind of how they interact. They can either support each other. So what you'll see on the AP test is you might see a question saying, how can interest groups support government agencies with regards to, the Iron Triangle or sub-governments or whatever you want to call it. And your answer should be that interest groups can support government agencies by publicizing the policy, by working with the agency to kind of roll it out and make it effective, or whatever. And then if it's like, how can interest groups support the congressional committee? The interest group can support the congressional committee through lobbying, through litigation if they need to. And that's the other thing. Interest groups can support the government agencies, but they can also make their life difficult by litigating. These guys have the ability to litigate any government policy. They could sue them. So, for example, Obamacare. They made Obamacare. Health committees, they basically put it together. These guys had to implement it, specifically Department of Health and Human Services. Big Pharma and some other interest groups that were kind of against Obamacare because it cost them profits, sued. Hobby Lobby. Hobby Lobby got a lot of support from interest groups when they sued Burwell, who was at the time the Secretary of Health and Human Services. So they sued the government agency for the implementation. So Hobby Lobby versus Burwell was specifically this. It was this group going after this agency, Health and Human Services, for their Obamacare rollout and how it's being implemented. They didn't sue Obamacare; they sued the agency responsible. So that's a negative interaction. A positive interaction would be as if an interest group provided support, or an interest group on behalf of some people sued some private institutions that weren't complying with the government agency. Maybe some workers, maybe instead and this did happen. The employees of Hobby Lobby felt that they were not receiving the benefits of Obamacare that the government agency is trying to roll out. So civil rights groups can sue Hobby Lobby on behalf of the employees, but that's supporting the government agency trying to roll out Obamacare. When Congress flipped from Democrat to Republican, these guys went from being supportive. They made the law for these guys to implement to being antagonistic. Now, the new congressional committee didn't like the law and they wanted to make it go away. So they engaged in a ton of hearings. Kathleen Sebelius, who was the next Health and Human Services Secretary, she was a Health and Human Services Secretary under Obama. Her name was Kathleen Sebelius. She spent days upon days upon days in congressional committees, which are under oath, which are televised, these guys were trying to make Sebelius and Obamacare and the Health and Human Services Agency look bad. That was the point. So you can see how the congressional committee originally supported the government agency because they made the law, they gave it to them to implement, and then later they went against them. Again, interest groups and congressional committees interact through lobbying and all that stuff too. That's kind of how the interest group works, and there's a couple examples and a couple pieces of ammunition for you to use if you got an AP question about the Iron Triangle and how they can work. I think I'll do another video on government agencies and kind of the different types and what they do. But for now, that's that. Okay.